In terms of coming to the SCU meeting, what was it that drew you to this meeting?
I went to the one last year, and that was actually my first conference in this area, but it was virtual, online only. So there being an in-person one this year, I kind of made it a priority to attend, partly because it really just relates to my research, and also partly because it's really fun. But yeah.
Okay. Well, so you went to the SCU online. You attended the Soul Foundation conference,
yes.
right? And then you've gone to some of the APEC conferences that I moderate too. So
yes, I have. Yeah.
You're just becoming more and more active, I guess, in the community.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
So, I mean, one thing to ask would be, with all of these conferences, what direction is kind of that drawing you? How is that influencing you?
Well, the reason that I started attending in the first place is just because of, like, for the research that I'm doing, it's about the science that's going on. Obviously, it's from an anthropological perspective, so it's not going to be the same as somebody who, like some of the speakers here who are really doing like the hard sciences, but I'm almost studying more like the people who are studying the hard sciences stuff, and how that's sort of developing as its own academic discipline with its own methodologies and its own standards for evidence, and things like the talk that we just heard of, like even just basic things like curating what sort of encounters people engage with for scientific study. All of that sort of stuff is really kind of just in the process of starting at this time, or it's getting started for sure, and there are more and more things being published all the time. So that is why I definitely make it a priority to come, is just to make sure that I'm sort of actually hearing what's going on as far as the latest science.
Well, so if it's okay, let me ask about the anthropology part of it then. Mm-hmm. Like, could you describe how that would apply to UAP?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of different ways that it could apply. Like, certainly anthropologists who study religion might be interested in it from that sort of perspective, the same as how there are a lot of religious studies scholars who are interested in the topic. And then where my background was more, and I was doing a different PhD project before this one, and it was basically about like expertise in pension funds and how all of that sort of works. And so it's kind of, I guess, the same literature is what I realized could apply to UAP studies, as far as, like, we call it like cultures of expertise, or expert cultures, or epistemic cultures, or something like that. And so I think it's really interesting, because I think that with UAP stuff right now, we're kind of at an area where, like, in the past it's been something that has been at least considered to be too fringe to be kind of out there in mainstream academia, and to have academics who are actually, saying, like, I'm going to study this, I'm going to publish things about this. So I think it's a really interesting moment for that reason, because I think right now, like, whatever happens, like, whatever's being published right now will be foundational. Like, other things will be referring back to it for as long as people are studying it in academia. So it's kind of at a place where a lot of those norms and disciplinary sort of guidelines are being set almost. I also think it's a really, like, UAP studies in general is a really interesting area, because, like, even at a conference like this, you can go and you can meet people with all sorts of different backgrounds, and they all have something, like, unique to contribute to this topic, because there really are just almost like an infinite number of ways to approach it. Like, you could build an observatory and try to see what you can observe about a UAP, or you could study the people who are studying them, or you can study the people who are trying to summon them, or like, you can study the history of it and comparative religion stuff about how different religious phenomenon might have been the same phenomenon as UAP, one way or the other. But
so I'm still thinking about the cultures of expertise, and mm-hmm. It's so when you said that, for me, what I've been, not as a good word, but I've been calling it intellectual microcultures. And,
right.
And one of the things that I've seen, like with my podcast, is I've done interviews with people who do consciousness research.
Right.
I've done interviews with people who are into AI and science fiction authors and things like that. And every one of these small cultures of expertise seems like they have the same concerns and problems and complaints, and one of those is, we're tiny and we're not acknowledged enough, and we wish that we had more recognition, and we feel isolated, right? And what's interesting is, for people who come up in one of these cultures, which is normal, they're like, well, I'm really into UAP, and how come people don't take it more seriously? What's interesting to me is seeing these different cultures, and they all have that same concern, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, consciousness studies is probably a really interesting parallel to UAP studies with that. I think also, I mean, I don't know that much about consciousness studies, but I've talked to some people who work in that area, and it seems like almost they have the same sort of like debate in a sense as happens in the UAP community and like the intellectual community around UAP, where it's like, on the one hand, there's like the very sorts of nuts and bolts, whatever, like consciousness is just something that exists in your brain, and it's just a series of chemicals and electric signals and all that sort of stuff. And then there's the other side where it's like, no, that's totally inadequate, and consciousness is not something that can even be thought of in that way. But I don't know. With both of those things, I tend to think that probably the answer is somewhere in the middle, but the debate rages on.
Well, was there something about UAP in particular that drew you to that? Because again, there are multiple, there is a consciousness community, and people tend to get drawn towards one or sometimes more, but what was it about UAP that drew you to this community?
I guess it's not really one thing, because I grew up really interested in like UFOs and flying saucers and extraterrestrials and all that sort of stuff. So like that sort of thing was always something that was on my mind. And then I guess like, I don't know, everyone says it, but it was kind of a big deal, when the New York Times published an article and was like, oh, by the way, UFOs are real and the government conspiracy is real, and, validated all of the stuff that I grew up kind of believing in, but also kind of thinking was crazy at the same time. And like, there's no way, but,
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, well, and I think that was like the Leslie Kean article, that was like a shot across the bow, right? And I think for a lot of people, they read that, and all of us have, going back to the cultural aspect of it, right? Traditional Western culture now has like, Independence Day, the movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Right.
I mean, we, E.T., Close Encounters. I mean, we have hundreds of movies that all reinforce these cultural stereotypes of UFOs. And so, yeah, I think I was very much in the same boat. The Leslie Kean article was like a wake-up call. That's kind of what it sounds like in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. I meet people all the time where I feel like most people, it's either like it was one article that Leslie Kean wrote usually, or I was going to say, or it was the Grush stuff, but that was also Leslie Kean. So.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, like, I don't know, that's where I feel like when I tend to meet like other academics who've gotten involved, not all the time, but I feel like often it's like one of those two things. But I basically just was following the story very closely, I guess, since that article, and like, okay, what are the new developments about this story and related stories and all that sort of thing. And then actually, it was probably like 2 years ago, because it was when I first heard about the Galileo project. I thought, this is a really interesting moment in this field, because like now it's not just national security, it's not just the kinds of conferences that people, I don't want to, sorry, cut this out. I was going to say Contact in the Desert, but I don't want to make fun of Contact in the Desert. But like that kind of conference where like people don't tend to think of it as like serious in the same way. But then when I heard about the Galileo project, it's like, I was like, yeah, okay, this is like something different that's happening now. This is like academia is taking this seriously. And basically I kind of was just following along about everything that was happening with Galileo and UAPX, and then about a year ago I was just having some major difficulties with my other research project. I went through the classic COVID student stall that I think most people went through. And so I just switched my research over to this. And interestingly, I didn't really have any pushback about it from my supervisor, even though I was studying a totally different thing beforehand.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, so in terms of Galileo Project versus kind of some of the older conferences, I've been to a few of those, and what I've seen is with a lot of those, it's almost like a tribal gathering, right? It's
right.
People come together to share culture and reinforce each other's beliefs, and so
For sure.
There's a lot of storytelling at those, but it is not necessarily science-based, and to be honest, it's not really evidence-based. It's more of cultural reinforcement, right? So maybe that's kind of what you're alluding to.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of it, that, and I think that's part of what contributes to people, like the general public sort of understanding that maybe this is not a quote unquote serious issue, is because there is a lot of that confirmation bias and just like reinforcing the same, like you said, like reinforcing the same sorts of ideas and the same sorts of narratives through storytelling. Absolutely. I mean, like you could almost like argue that there's like this whole sort of like oral tradition around like storytelling tradition around this stuff, because I mean certainly there are books that are written about it as well, but also at the same time even just like in this space, sometimes I don't know some piece of esoteric UFO lore and I ask people about it, and then everyone just tells the story about this is supposedly what happened, and this person was connected. It's almost like an epic poem in a way. Like that's probably the best. Like
well, maybe that is an oral tradition.
Yeah,
right?
like it has all of these different verses, and they're almost interchangeable, and different verses get told at different times in different contexts. But yeah.
But one of the differences, it seems like, with this oral tradition is the taboos that are involved and the stigma that seems to still be there, and that's one of the things
definitely true
that I have read. I keep reading these articles saying the stigma is disappearing, but then when you talk to people, they feel persecuted. And one of the things that troubles me, and I talked about this with someone the other night, was, if someone has a belief in any of the major religions, or really even any of the minor religions, like people who practice Wiccan or anything like that, it's illegal to discriminate against them, and it's also socially unacceptable to make fun of them. And yet with UFOs, for some reason, we've carved that out and said, you know what, it's okay, go for it, make fun of them.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it's definitely, it's interesting too, though, because I think like with the people who I've talked to about it, and I don't just necessarily mean scientists alone, but like people that I know personally and I'm friends with who have an interest in this topic, but don't necessarily like, or they still have some sort of squeamishness about it in a way where it's like they have, even though they're interested in it and like they find themselves wanting to know more about it, it's like almost like they also have this simultaneous impulse that they need to like pull back from it and prevent themselves from really getting interested in it. And I think partly it's because like we have generally, I would say, in the United States, most people kind of think of culture and religion and science as two different things, and many people in both of those camps see them as diametrically opposed to one another. So there's like almost, like you said, there's this more like cultural, almost like story-based tradition in this world, and then there's also like this hard sciences sort of like nuts and bolts approach that is that has just kind of become a little bit more drawn into the focus in the last like 7 or 8 years or so. And it's like almost even within the community, and I mean I say community, but it's really like not one community of people that's interested in this topic. There's many communities, and I feel like people overlap in all sorts of different areas and then don't in others. But it's something that I see with my research, because I have had people, including other researchers, but often people who are just like involved in the wider UFO UAP community who will tell me like, you are wasting your time on this, like trying to study this as a science, because it's not. Like it's something much, much deeper. It's spiritual. It's it's really profound. And then on the other hand, obviously there are the people who are like, no, this is a nuts and bolts issue. Like we are going to solve this with science and the scientific method, and you are wasting your time to try to treat this as like a spiritual sort of problem. And I think, I mean, personally, I think that those are both completely valid ways of approaching it. But I think that people who are like hard in either of those camps just seem to put each other off. And so it's interesting because I don't even put myself necessarily in like the box of like, I think that the scientific method and whatever is like the only way that we're ever going to understand the phenomenon. I don't think that, but I also think it's a really fascinating way to try to understand the phenomenon, and it's one that hasn't really been given any, or not any, but given like much due consideration, at least for the wider public. And to circle back to, I think what you actually initially asked me is like, I think, I mean, I know some people have told me that almost like it seems too religious for them. Like it's like they're really interested in the scientific stuff, but like it is like that culture of like, it's like the lore and the storytelling and all of that stuff that can't necessarily always be verified, but often is accepted as general fact, often isn't, but like it's like they're put off by that stuff, but they're really interested in the science. Because I think it is kind of like almost related to a wider stigma of religion and well, I mean, I like religion and superstition, I would say like in a more anthropological sense, not like calling anybody's religion superstition, but yeah, it's like almost some people find that that's like a taboo sort of way of thinking about the world, and I think that well, I don't think that people told me that, but yeah.
Well, and what you're talking about, that's led me. I've had some deep questions about that myself, I guess, because in some ways the storytelling aspect of this, it goes to the heart of faith and belief and religion, but also, you know, like a lot of modern science is storytelling, and I would contend that science itself is much more of a belief system than we'd like to admit.
Oh,
right?
definitely. Yeah.
And so, you know, we like to say evidence is based on data and logic, but there's also a lot of human intuition involved with that. And so really we have these different competing belief systems, and that they're overlapping, right? And that's made me wonder, you know. But in the case of religion, it's like the best that I've been able to kind of come up with is maybe religion is kind of a codified system of stories and beliefs versus superstition, which is more fluid. And so maybe UFOs are, at least right now, in this superstition category. I don't have a firm answer there, but
yeah, I feel like I kind of just made that up when I said superstition, but I mean, like, I think a lot of people, like you said, like science is absolutely a belief system. It's a way of interpreting our reality, just the same as anything else. Yeah, like you said, though, I think the key is like a lot of people, like you said, not everyone necessarily wants to think of it in that way, which is also the case with religion. And I mean, there are people who have argued that science basically just is a religion. I would say probably like not quite entirely, but also like we still think of them as separate things, even if they share a lot of foundations in common. It's like in American society, most people definitely think of like there is science and then there is religion, and often the two of them don't mix well in people's opinions about it. Like,
yeah, it all gets convoluted. Well, like, so one example that comes to my mind was, so the Fermi paradox. I did some research on this, and you know, when Enrico Fermi, he was at a lunch table with some other physicists in the 1950s, and he basically saw an article, he saw something in a newspaper, and he said, well, you know, if they exist, why aren't they here? Where are they? You know, and
Right.
that led to this idea of the Fermi paradox, which has been this point of contention, you know, in astrobiology for, you know, decades now. But the backstory to that, though, is the article he was referring to was, it was a I forgot the magazine name, but it was an article with a cartoon about a UFO and space aliens stealing garbage cans in New York City. Because at the time, New York City was having some issue with missing garbage cans, and the cartoonist thought it would be funny. So you have this identified notion of UFOs and space aliens
Right.
as the inspiration for him asking, where are they? And I was like, well, again, to me, when I learned that, I was like, that seems like a tremendous lack of logic. It's a gap, right? He makes that jump. He's like, well, you know, if they exist, where are they? Well, it's saying that they're here, the cartoon, right? It's like,
Right.
okay, there's a UFO on Earth, and it's based on testimony and observations.
For
and,
sure.
You know, so, yeah, it's intriguing. It's intriguing.
Yeah, it is. It's really intriguing, and like, I'm not a historian or a folklorist or anything, but I think it's really fascinating, like this idea that we have been seeing anomalous things, and you could probably put all of them at least into the category of like non-human intelligence, if you're going to use that as a broad term. But you know, all over the world for as long as we're aware of, pretty much, like people have these stories of often like little men or like little visitors or people that visit, often things like, you know, fairies or brownies or elves or,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and it's definitely, I mean, this isn't a new thought or anything, but it still like kind of cooks your noodle to think about
for me, yes.
what is that like? Yeah, what is that? Is that an external phenomenon that we're all experiencing and interpreting through our own lenses, or is it something internal? Which again, I guess just goes back to like consciousness stuff.
Well, and for me, it's like almost like a chicken or egg, right? Because like you mentioned, fairies and brownies and elves and things like that. So then, are the grays in the UFO community, is that a modernization of old folklore, or could it be vice versa?
Right.
Where fairies and brownies and elves were actually grays, people just didn't know what they were, so they just made up terms for them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really valid point, because most of the time you hear it made the argument that, like, you know, we're seeing, you know, fairies or whatever, some sort of fae, and we're just interpreting it as space aliens. And often people kind of draw that cultural connection between like apparently this all sort of started around the time of the space race, and I guess the idea behind that is that people were thinking about outer space a lot, and so we assumed that when we were seeing these things that they had come from outer space or something. I don't know. I mean, I think also it's interesting because I'm not an abductee by any means. I hesitate to even call myself an experiencer, because I don't think that I've had all that interesting of experiences, but I've like seen things in the sky is pretty much the extent to which I've had it. But like, I do know some people who are really hardcore experiencers.
Okay.
And I think it's interesting as well, like what they, like the knowledge that they get from those experiences often is that being has come like from another planet, or like that they're extraterrestrial and things like that. So I don't think that's worth discounting either.
No,
But
a lot of people have talked about this consciousness connection. Like in those cases, do you think that could be because they've been somehow touched by this external consciousness, or do you think it could be, and I'm just shooting in the dark, but do you think that it could be maybe having to confront the unknown in a very personal way leads them to this conclusion? It forces them to say, this is what I believe.
I honestly have no idea. But I will say, like, one of the things that I think is interesting about this, and I kind of wonder if it doesn't account for some people's squeamishness about this topic, is because like once you do consider that like nuts and bolts, UAPs, like the observable stuff that we see in the sky and that we can detect on our instruments, like once you admit that those are a real thing, then it does kind of like lead down a rabbit hole of like, well, what else is real? What about ghosts? What about poltergeists? What about Sasquatch? What about all of it, you know, right? Because like once one of it is real, but people do often in this community like kind of draw a boundary around what they're comfortable believing in or what they're not. But I think for other people outside of it, sometimes it's almost like, I'm just talking about like some of the people in my like friend group that I've talked to about this and stuff, because I think that there is like sometimes a little bit of a squeamishness where it's like once you start to consider that this might be real and that this might be like a profound truth of humanity, then you kind of like there's like almost like a domino effect of all the other things that you have to consider, and ultimately that kind of goes back to like consciousness and like this really profound idea of like what are we and why are we here and all that, and that's uncomfortable.
Well, so maybe that is kind of the ultimate lesson from all of this is that this is like, you know, as much as we talk about extraterrestrial or non-human intelligence, this seems to be a very human issue, and I think a big part of that is it's one of the many things forcing us to define and redefine our species, right? It's like, what does it mean to be human? And that's not just something in UAP, but we're also confronting that with artificial intelligence.
Oh, for sure.
And, you know, and the consciousness communities approaching that, there's a big convergence there. And so it is intriguing because what you're driving towards is really this larger question that's entirely human in nature.
Oh, absolutely. I'll take credit for that profound thought, but I mean, it's something people say all the time about how like, at least like American society these days like doesn't have the same firm religious sort of background, I guess, that they once did. But and you know, people make that argument all the time as far as like, this is why more and more people are getting involved in extremist movements, or this is why people believe in UFOs or whatever. But it definitely, as much as whenever I hear that, I think like, there are so many religious people in America. I don't know that that's entirely, you know, can account for any one of society's ills, is that we're not religious enough anymore. But at the same time, it definitely seems like for a lot of people that, I don't know, like there's sort of like almost like a soul searching going on or something like that.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I've seen that with many people where the way that I've kind of looked at it is it's more difficult for many people to accept the idea of a burning bush that talks, but in the case of something from another planet, you know, we have this idea that planets exist, life probably exists, and so they can see a path there for it to work. Whereas with the burning bush, they look at that and say, okay, that's old culture, right? We know more now. So, but the interesting thing is, again, these are all really storytelling, and so in a way, one is not necessarily more real than the other. It's just maybe more acceptable in modern context.
Yeah, definitely. And we are at a really interesting point right now as well. And I think like with where we're at with like space exploration is probably also a kind of under-recognized contributor to like why this is now kind of allowed a more mainstream audience, or, you know, like why newspapers can publish about this sort of thing now when perhaps they couldn't in the past, and why more people are interested in podcasts and books and just kind of like hearing about this, because it's like, I just went with some friends to the Space Center yesterday, and we went to a planetarium show, and it talked about all of the planets in our solar system, and then it zoomed out and it talked about our galaxy, and then it zoomed out and talked about how now we think there's like 2 trillion galaxies or something like that.
Yeah.
But even if there was like 10,000 galaxies, like how giant is a galaxy, right? Like what is the probability that there has to be life somewhere else? And then I think there's this kind of increased recognition the more we learn about like exoplanets and how many of them, even if we assume that life is only probably going to happen on conditions like basically exactly the same as on planet Earth. Well, like now, you know, we understand that there are a lot of exoplanets that have conditions really similar to planet Earth.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
and I think it's becoming more and more a thing where I think, like, personally, I think sooner or later, like one of these days, you know, we're gonna prove that life exists on other planets, and for some people, that's probably all they need to.
So that goes to changing paradigms, and that I know for me, it's one of those things where when I really started to think about it, and this is from past story research that I've done, but so there are between 100 billion and 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy alone, just our galaxy.
Right.
And with Frank Drake, who came up with the Drake equation, he estimated there were 10,000 active radio band civilizations, right? They're broadcasting or receiving.
Right.
So that's kind of our pool of potential groups. But there's what came out of that, which I think all of us just tend to overlook, is for each one of those 10,000 groups, there may be thousands more, potentially millions more planets with life of some kind. And for each of those, there may be thousands or millions more planets with ancient ruins, right? Because, I mean, the galaxy is about 13.9 billion years old.
Right.
We're very late to the game. So in that context, when I started to really think about this, I was like, that's amazing. We live in a galaxy full of life. I mean, by every educated estimate, you know? So then, for me, this idea of, if it's full of life, full of ruins, potentially full of robots or, you know, who knows what.
I hope it's full of robots.
then what are the odds that some of those may have found us, right? And just washed up on our shore, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, yeah, space is a whole lot of emptiness, but we're out there looking for other things. Like, why wouldn't anybody, like, why would we assume that if there are other life on other planets, why wouldn't they be looking for us? You'd be pretty lonely to think that we're all alone up here.
And that goes to the message from Contact, right, with Jodie Foster, which is one of my favorite movies.
I haven't seen it.
Oh,
I've seen an embarrassingly few number of classic sci-fi movies.
The thing that I really loved this about that movie is so many times UFO aliens are portrayed as a stereotype, right? And so they're here to destroy us, or if they're our friends, they're hokey and not intelligent or socially awkward or whatever. And in Contact, which was really, Carl Sagan was really saying a lot when he wrote the book, and the movie tried to capture most of that. Essentially what they say is, it's a big, empty universe, and life seeks out life because it gets lonely, right? And I think one of the other things that they were making the point of in the movie was, it's not a quick process, right? It's not like, hey, we're here. It's more like, you know, you announce your presence and let that kind of sink in over time. You don't move too fast, right? And so maybe some of those are things that we're seeing with UAP.
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, personally, I don't know what they are, but I like the idea that they're space aliens. Like, that's what I prefer them to be. I think the other stuff, sometimes, like, I start thinking about it, it just gets too creepy to really consider. But I like the idea that, you know,
what is the... Because you know, in terms of so we have the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I think that's the one that, when we think UFOs, I think that's what everybody thinks. Then we have Hal Puthoff's ultra-terrestrials, which basically could be, they used to be extraterrestrial, but they've been here for a really long time. or maybe they evolved here, like the Silurian hypothesis, some ancient lost civilization.
Right.
So those are the big two. Then there's this interdimensional idea and the time travel idea.
Right. I actually really like the time travel idea. That was like one of the things I remember my grandpa bringing up when I was a kid. I remember him telling me once that that they were actually us, far evolved in the future.
Okay.
And then we moved off world, and then we moved back on world because we wanted to check out what we were like in the past. So yeah, I like that one actually. That one doesn't creep me out as much. But what I will say, the other ones, I think they're totally just as plausible as any of the other hypotheses, but it does kind of creep me out, the idea that there's something that's way more intelligent than us, and it's from Earth, and it's been watching us the entire time, and it's, I don't know why that creeps me out more than the idea that it would be because I guess when I think of them as being extraterrestrial, they would be friendly in my mind, but
okay,
I don't know.
Well, so that's the creepy thing.
Yeah,
Although
that's
that could go the other way.
It totally goes the other way.
You look at this highly intelligent species looking at us going, oh my God, we're so gonna die. Just leave the humans alone.
Right. No, yeah, definitely. And I think really probably what is creepy about all of them is just the idea that what it seems evident is that there is something a lot more intelligent than human beings on planet Earth with us.
Do you think that might explain this consciousness aspect of it? Because for me, this goes back to language, right? It's language and thought, but
right.
It seems like the communications that happen appear to be nonverbal. Experiencers say that. They say the people who report communications, it seems to be nonverbal in nature. They'll realize things. Many of them have reported some kind of telepathic thing, and I've wondered, maybe whatever this is evolved past the kind of language that we use.
I was just actually having this conversation with some people really recently, and okay, so this is, I think we're at an interesting moment with language in particular, because there's all this stuff that's going on with machine learning and AI to understand cetaceans and what they're saying to each other in the ocean, and that potentially is another form of language. And so in anthropology, linguistic anthropology, we say that language is self-referential, so it's you should be able to discuss language using language, right? You can there's communication for sure that is not necessarily a full language, but language is a very advanced, I guess a very advanced form of communication that is highly movable, highly, you can do a lot to communicate with language. You can communicate about a lot of things. And there's the famous example of Coco the gorilla that supposedly used sign language. And unfortunately, it seems like maybe she wasn't communicating as much as people would like to maybe think that she was. But partly it's what I always think about that is that people have kind of argued that she probably wasn't really, she didn't know sign language, she just had a really strong bond with her handlers and was able to communicate with them about her needs. It was almost more like to the outside observer, the sign language that she used, probably you wouldn't be able to understand it, but the handlers could understand it.
That reminds me of a story about a horse that could count by tapping its feet, and if I remember correctly, this was, I think, college psychology. It was the horse's handler was actually subconsciously giving it cues, and so the horse would kind of look at the handler, and it just wanted to please because it loved its handler and wanted food, and so So it would kind of look at the handler and look for these subconscious cues the person didn't even know about, and just kind of tap its foot until the handler would be satisfied.
Right.
Yeah, that's what Coco. So maybe not using language as much as we thought.
Yeah, but I think so Coco probably didn't have language in the same way we understand it, but what is very evident is that Coco had a very strong, like, non-verbal, non-language ability to communicate emotionally with her handlers. So there's some sort of communication there that's not language, and it's, it's something like deeply nonverbal, but also, and it's not signing either, but it's also like really emotional. And I think sometimes, like, I wonder about that with like the communications that people receive, because it's like, okay, so dogs communicate with each other in a pack and they get along just fine.
And it's nonverbal. It's
nonverbal, and it's not language. But, like, humans communicate with each other using language, and it's more advanced, and it has like the ability to do more. So I think it's not worth discounting that, like, if there were something that was a lot more intelligent than we are, as we are a lot more intelligent than dogs are, maybe there's some other sort of communication that they have figured out that,
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, it's hard to say because we just don't know, right?
And again, this brings us back to ultimately confronting ourselves.
We just don't know what the possibilities are, because we can only really say what our possibilities are as humans. So
the only reason I've wondered about it is, again, I think language, if I remember correctly, is something like 200,000 maybe, and I may have this very incorrect, but I think it's about 200,000 years old. The human brain obviously has been evolving for millions and millions of years.
Yeah.
And so for most of that time, language just wasn't a part of it. That's not to say that it isn't useful. Obviously, everything we do is based on language, but then at the same time, it seems like it's taking broad concepts and putting them into discrete little boxes. And I can't help but wonder if a higher intelligence might not have found a better way to do that. Maybe that's why they can't communicate.
Yeah, and there's also like a very human tendency to think that we are always the exception. Even like with Neanderthals, for example, they lived alongside us for a very long time.
Yeah.
I think, like most people with European, and I think the highest concentrations are among like European and West Asian ancestry, but like a lot of people, if not most people, have some level of genetic information that comes from Neanderthals rather than Homo sapiens. So they were basically fully human, right? But there's still this weird stereotype that was around for so long, and I mean, I guess it is still around, that Neanderthals were like stupid and brutish, and like the fact that they eventually died out is probably because they were so like stupid and inferior to Homo sapiens. But yeah, I don't know. Do we even know that they died out necessarily, or that they just bred into the human population? Probably somebody does know that, and I just am not up on that most recent research. But one of the things is that I remember, like, when I was doing my undergrad, we heard about the FOXP2 gene, I think is what it's called, which is a genetic allele, I guess, that, I don't know if I'm even saying that correctly, but it's a gene that we have that is associated with language use, because people who have some sort of disorder on that particular gene, like, they basically don't have the ability to speak, even though their anatomy, like their larynx and everything, is still the same as ours. But so there seems to be something with that gene, and then they figured out that Neanderthals also have that gene. So genetically, we figured they probably could speak the same way that us, because even up until recently, like, people were still arguing that we we don't know for sure that Neanderthals could even speak, and we think that we might be the only ones who could speak. And actually, a researcher at my university recently did some research on the anatomy of their, I guess, throat and mouth and everything, that suggests also that they, basically Neanderthals could probably speak. It would be more of a surprise if they couldn't than if they could. But then also we have all of this research from experimental archaeology and stuff that shows that they basically were the same as us in every way. Like, they were just as smart, they were just as capable of making tools, they were just as capable of practicing medicine and caring for each other. I forget where I was going with this. Oh, just, I guess that humans, I think, sometimes run into a lack of imagination when it comes to things that are not humans, because we just think of ourselves as
Yeah, and to circle back again to the beginning, which is really your PhD in cultural anthropology.
Right.
To me, it almost seems like it is a projection of ourselves, right? It's almost like through a mirror darkly, where we're looking into this mirror back at ourselves, projecting our beliefs and our fears and our hopes and our expectations onto something that may be completely different.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Maya, thank you so much for your time. It has truly been a pleasure and an honor speaking with you.
You too. Thank you.